Section 5 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 4, Imperial Antiquity, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Marcus Aurelius, Part 1. A.D. 121 to 180. The Glory of Rome. Marcus Aurelius is immortal, not so much for what he did, as for what he was. His services to the state were considerable, but not transcendent. He was a great man, but not preeminently a great emperor. He was a meditative sage, rather than a man of action, although he successfully fought the Germanic barbarians and repelled their fearful incursions. He did not materially extend the limits of the empire, but he preserved and protected its provinces. He reigned wisely and ably, but made mistakes. His greatness was in his character, his influence for good was in his noble example. When we consider his circumstances and temptations, as the supreme master of a vast empire, and in a wicked and sensual age, he is a greater moral phenomenon than Socrates or Epictetus. He was one of the best men of pagan antiquity. History furnishes no example of an absolute monarch so pure and spotless and lofty as he was, unless it be Alfred the Great or Saint Louis. But the sphere of the Roman emperor was far greater than that of the medieval kings. Marcus Aurelius ruled over 120 millions of people without check or hindrance or constitutional restraint. He could do what he pleased with their persons and their property. Most sovereigns, exalted to such lofty dignity and power, have been either cruel or vindictive, or self-indulgent, or selfish, or proud, or hard, or ambitious. Men who have been stained by crimes, whatever may have been their services to civilization. Most of them have yielded to their great temptations. But Marcus Aurelius, on the throne of the civilized world, was modest, virtuous, affable, accessible, considerate, gentle, studious, contemplative, stained by novices, a model of human virtue. Hence he is one of the favorite characters of history. No Roman emperor was so revered and loved as he, and of no one have so many monuments been preserved. Everybody had his picture or statue in his house. He was more than venerated in his day, and his fame as a wise and good man has increased with the flight of ages. This illustrious emperor did not belong to the family of the great Caesar. That family became extinct with Nero, the sixth emperor. Like Trajan and Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius derived his remote origin from Spain, although he was born in Rome. His great-grandfather was a Spaniard, and yet attained to the praetorian rank. His grandfather reached the consulate. His father died while praetor, when he himself was a child. He was adopted by his grandfather Annius Verus, but his marvelous moral beauty, even as a child, attracted the attention of the Emperor Hadrian, who bestowed upon him the honor of equestrian rank at the age of 6. At 15 he was adopted by Antonius Pius, then, as we might say, crown prince. Had he been older, he would have been adopted by Hadrian himself. He thus, a mere youth, became the heir of the Roman world. His education was most excellent. From Fronto, the greatest rhetorician of the day, he learned rhetoric. From Herodes Atticus he acquired a knowledge of the world. From Diognetus he learned to despise superstition. From Apollonius, undeviating steadiness of purpose. From Sextus of Chaeronea, toleration of human infirmities. From Maximus, sweetness and dignity. From Alexander, allegiance to duty. From Rusticus, contempt of sophistry and display. This stoical philosopher created in him a new intellectual life, and opened to him a new world of thought. But the person to whom he was most indebted was his adopted father and father-in-law, the Emperor Antoninus Pius. From him he seems to have had the greatest reverence. In him, said he, I noticed mildness of manner with firmness of resolution, contempt of vainglory, industry in business, and accessibility of person. From him I learned to acquiesce in every fortune, to exercise foresight in public affairs, to rise superior to vulgar phrases, to serve mankind without ambition, to be sober and steadfast, to be content with little, to be practical and active, to be no dreamy bookworm, to be temperate, modest in dress, and not to be led away by novelties. What a picture of an emperor! What a contrast to such a man as Louis XIV! We might draw a parallel between Marcus Aurelius and David when he was young and innocent, but the person in history whom he most resembled was Saint Anselm. He was a Saint Anselm on the throne. Philosophical meditations seem to have been his delight and recreation, and yet he could issue from his retirement and engage in active pursuits. He was an able general as well as a meditative sage, heroic like David, capable of enduring great fatigue, and willing to expose himself to great dangers. While his fame rests on his meditations, as that of David rests upon his Psalms, he yet rendered great military services to the Empire. He put down a dangerous revolt under Avidius Cassius in Asia, and did not punish the rebellious provinces. Not one person suffered death in consequence of this rebellion. Even the papers of Cassius, who aimed to be emperor, were burned, that a revelation of enemies might not be made, a signal instance of magnanimity. Cassius, it seems, was assassinated by his own officers, which assassination Marcus Aurelius regretted, because it deprived him of granting a free pardon to a very able but dangerous man. But the most signal service he rendered the empire was a successful resistance to the barbarians of Germany, who had formed a general union for the invasion of the Roman world. They threatened the security of the empire as the Teutons did in the time of Marius, and the Gauls and Germans in the time of Julius Caesar. It took him 20 years to subdue these fierce warriors. He made successive campaigns against them, as Charlemagne did against the Saxons. It cost him the best years of his life to conquer them, which he did under difficulties as great as Julius surmounted in Gaul. He was the savior and deliverer of his country, as much as Marius or Scipio or Julius. The public dangers were from the west and not the east. Yet he succeeded in erecting a barrier against barbaric inundations, so that for nearly 200 years the Romans were not seriously molested. There still stands in the Eternal City the column which commemorates his victories, not so beautiful as that of Trajan, which furnished the model for Napoleon's column in the Place Vendôme, but still greatly admired. Were he not better known for his writings, he would be famous as one of the great military emperors, like Vespasian, Diocletian, and Constantine. Perhaps he did not add to the art of war. That was perfected by Julius Caesar. It was with the mechanism of former generals that he withstood most dangerous enemies, for in his day the legions were still well disciplined and irresistible. The only stains on the reign of this good and great emperor, for there were none on his character, were in allowing the elevation of his son Commodus as his successor, and his persecution of the Christians. In regard to the first, it was a blunder rather than a fault. Peter the Great caused his heir to be tried and sentenced to death, because he was a sot, a liar, and a fool. He dared not entrust the interests of his empire to so unworthy a son. The welfare of Russia was more to him than the interest of his family. In that respect, this stern and iron man was a greater prince than Marcus Aurelius, for the law of succession was not established at Rome any more than in Russia. There was no danger of civil war should the natural succession be set aside, as might happen in the feudal monarchies of Europe. The Emperor of Rome could adopt or elect his successor. It would have been wise for Aurelius to have selected one of the ablest of his generals, or one of the wisest of his senators, as Hadrian did, for so great and responsible a position, rather than a wicked, cruel, dissolute son. But Commodus was the son of Faustina also, an intriguing and wicked woman whose influence over her husband was unfortunately great, and, what is common in this world, the son was more like the mother than the father. I think the wife of Eli the high priest must have been a bad woman. All his teachings and virtues were lost on such a reprobate. She, as an unscrupulous and ambitious woman, had no idea of seeing her son supplanted in the imperial dignity, and, like Catherine de' Medici and Agrippina, probably she connived at and even encouraged the vices of her children in order more easily to bear rule. At any rate, the succession of Commodus to the throne was the greatest calamity that could have happened. For 5 reigns the empire had enjoyed peace and prosperity; for 5 reigns the tide of corruption had been stayed; but the flood of corruption swept all barriers away with the accession of Commodus, and from that day the decline of the empire was rapid and fatal. Still, probably nothing could have long arrested ruin. The empire was doomed. The other fact which obscured the glory of Marcus Aurelius as a sovereign was his persecution of the Christians, for which it is hard to account when the beneficent character of the emperor is considered. His reign was signalized for an imperial persecution, in which Justin at Rome, Polycarp at Smyrna, and Ponthonus at Lyons suffered martyrdom. It was not the first persecution. Under Nero the Christians had been cruelly tortured, nor did the virtuous Trajan change the policy of the government. Hadrian and Antoninus Pius permitted the laws to be enforced against the Christians, and Marcus Aurelius saw no reason to alter them. But to the mind of the Stoic on the throne, says Arnold, the Christians were philosophically contemptible, politically subversive, and morally abominable. They were regarded as statesmen looked upon the Jesuits in the reign of Louis XV, as we look upon the Mormons, as dangerous to free institutions. Moreover, the Christians were everywhere misunderstood and misrepresented. It was impossible for Marcus Aurelius to see the Christians except through a mist of prejudices. Christianity grew up in the catacombs, not on the Palatine. In allowing the laws to take their course against a body of men who were regarded with distrust and aversion as enemies of the state, the emperor was simply unfortunate. Such a wise and good man, perhaps, ought to have known the Christians better. But not knowing them, he cannot be stigmatized as a cruel man. How different the fortunes of the Church had Aurelius been the first Christian emperor instead of Constantine! Or had his wife Faustina known the Christians as well as Marcia, the mistress of Commodus, perhaps the persecution might not have happened, and perhaps it might. Earnest and sincere men have often proved intolerant when their peculiar doctrines have been assailed, like Athanasius and Saint Bernard. A stoical philosopher was trained, like a doctor of the Jewish Sanhedrim, in a certain intellectual pride. The fame of Marcus Aurelius rests, as it has been said, on his philosophical reflections, as his meditations attest. This remarkable book has come down to us while most of the annals of the age have perished, so that even Niebuhr confesses that he knows less of the reign of Marcus Aurelius than of the early kings of Rome. Perhaps that is one reason why Gibbon begins his history with the later emperors. But the meditations of the good emperor survive, like the writings of Epictetus, Saint Augustine, and Thomas à Kempis, one of the few immortal books, immortal in this case not for artistic excellence, like the writings of Thucydides and Tacitus, but for the loftiness of thoughts alone, so precious that the saints of the Middle Ages secretly preserved them as in accord with their own experiences. It is from these meditations that we derive our best knowledge of Marcus Aurelius. They reveal the man, and a man of sorrows, as the truly great are apt to be, when brought in contact with a world of wickedness, as were Alfred and Dante. In these meditations there is a striking resemblance to the discourses of Epictetus, which alike reveal the lofty and yet sorrowful soul, and are among the most valuable fragments which have come down from pagan antiquity. And this is remarkable, since Epictetus was a Phrygian slave, of the lowest parentage. He belonged to the secretary and companion of Nero, whose name was Epaphroditus, and who treated this poor Phrygian with great cruelty. And yet, what is very singular, the master caused the slave to be indoctrinated in the Stoical philosophy on account of a rare intelligence which commanded respect. He was finely manumitted, but lived all his life in the deepest poverty, to which he attached no more importance than Socrates did at Athens. In his miserable cottage he had no other furniture than a straw pallet and an iron lamp, which last somebody stole. His sole remark on the loss of the only property he possessed was, that when the thief came again he would be disappointed to find only an earthen lamp instead of an iron one. This earthen lamp was subsequently purchased by a hero worshipper for 3,000 drachmas ($150). Epictetus, much as he despised riches and poverty and luxury and hypocrisy and pedantry and all Phariseeism, living in the depths of poverty, was yet admired by eminent men, among whom was the Emperor Hadrian himself; and he found a disciple in Arian, who was to him what Xenophon was to Socrates, committing his precious thoughts to writing, and these thoughts were to antiquity what the Imitation of Christ was to the Middle Ages, accepted by Christians as well as by pagans, and even to day regarded as one of the most beautiful treatises on morals ever composed by man. The great peculiarity of the manual and the discourses is the elevation of the soul over external evils, the duty of resignation to whatever God sends, and the obligation to do right because it is right. Epictetus did not go into the dreary dialectics of the schools, but, like Socrates, confined himself to practical life, to the practice of virtue as the greatest good, and valued the joys of true intellectual independence. To him his mind was his fortune, and he desired no better. We do not find in the stoicism of the Phrygian slave the devout and lofty spiritualism of Plato, thirsting for God and immortality. It may be doubted whether he believed in immortality at all, but he did recognize what is most noble in human life, the subservience of the passions to reason, the power of endurance, patience, charity, and disinterested action. He did recognize the necessity of divine aid in the struggles of life, the glory of friendship, the tenderness of compassion, the power of sympathy. His philosophy was human, and it was cheerful, since he did not believe in misfortune, and exalted gentleness and philanthropy. Above everything he sought inward approval, not the praises of the world, that happiness which lies within oneself, in the absence of all ignoble fears, in contentment, in that peace of the mind which can face poverty, disease, exile, and death. Such were the lofty views which, embodied in the discourses of Epictetus, fell into the hands of Marcus Aurelius in the progress of his education, and exercised such a great influence on his whole subsequent life. The slave became the teacher of the emperor, which it is impossible to conceive of unless their souls were in harmony. As a Stoic, the emperor would not be less on his throne than the slave in his cottage. The trappings and pomps of imperial state became indifferent to him, since they were external, and were of small moment compared with that high spiritual life which he desired to lead. If poverty and pain were nothing to Epictetus, so grandeur and power and luxury should be nothing to him, both alike being merely outward things, like the clothes which cover a man. And the fewer the impediments in the march after happiness and the truth, the better. Does a really great and preoccupied man care what he wears? A shocking bad hat was perhaps as indifferent to Gladstone as a dirty old cloak was to Socrates. I suppose if a man is known to be brainless it is necessary for him to wear a disguise, even as instinct prompts a frivolous and empty woman to put on jewels. But who expects a person recognized as a philosopher to use a mental crutch or wear a moral mask? Who expects an old man, compelling attention by his wisdom, to dress like a dandy? It is out of place, it is not even artistic, it is ridiculous. That only is an evil which shackles the soul. Aurelius aspired to its complete emancipation. Not for the joys of a future heaven did he long, but for the realities and certitudes of earth, the placidity and harmony and peace of his soul, so long as it was doomed to the trials and temptations of the world, and a world too which he did not despise, but which he sought to benefit. So what was contentment in the slave became philanthropy in the emperor. He would be a benefactor, not by building baths and theatres, but by promoting peace, prosperity, and virtue. He would endure cheerfully the fatigue of winter campaigns upon the frozen Danube, if the empire could be saved from violence. To extend its boundaries, like Julius, he cared nothing, but to preserve what he had was a supreme duty. His watchword was duty, to himself, his country, and God. He lived only for the happiness of his subjects. Benevolence became the law of his life. Self-abnegation destroyed self-indulgence. For what was he, placed by Providence in the highest position in the world, except to benefit the world? The happiness of 120 millions was greater than the joys of any individual existence. And what were any pleasures which ended in vanity to the sublime placidity of an emancipated soul? Stoicism, if it did not soar to God and immortality, yet aspired to the freedom and triumph of what is most precious in man. And it equally despised, with haughty scorn, those things which corrupted and degraded this higher nature, the glorious dignity of unfettered intellect. The accidents of earth were nothing in his eyes, neither the purple of kings nor the rags of poverty. It was the soul in its transcendent dignity which alone was to be preserved and purified. This was the exalted realism which appears in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and which he had learned from the inspirations of a slave. Yet such was the inborn, almost supernatural loftiness of Aurelius that, had he been the slave and Epictetus the emperor, the same moral wisdom would have shone in the teachings and life of each, for they both were God's witnesses of truth in an age of wickedness and shame. It was he who chose them both, and sent them out as teachers of righteousness, the one from the humblest cottage, the other from the most significant palace of the capital of the world. In station they were immeasurably apart; in aim and similarity of ideas they were kindred spirits, one of the phenomena of the moral history of our race; for the slave, in his physical degradation, had all the freedom and grandeur of an aspiring soul, and the emperor, on his lofty throne, had all the humility and simplicity of a peasant in the lowliest state of poverty and suffering. Surely circumstances had nothing to do with this marvellous exhibition. It was either the mind and soul triumphant over and superior to all outward circumstances, or it was God imparting an extraordinary moral power. Section 6